Gus Carter, the Spectator's deputy features editor, writes in this week's magazine that men are in crisis. To explain, he joins me now with Nina Power, a columnist at Compact magazine. Gus, you write in the magazine that young boys are in a bind. Tell us why.
Well, I think the argument that I make in the magazine is that young boys are basically faced with a new form of sexual politics, which treats them as though they're inherently dangerous to girls and young women, that treats them as though they basically can't control their instincts. And we see this in adverts on the tube. There are signs that say unwanted staring is sexual harassment and that kind of thing. But there are also these groups going into schools that are talking to young boys, and they're saying basically masculinity is something that needs to be changed. And they're saying, again, we need to stop violence against women and girls. All things that are, perfectly good and proper. Everyone agrees with that. I think the problem is that in some ways the pendulum has swung to such an extent that boys feel like they can't express any form of masculinity, really.
Nina, do you think that young men in the West are being unfairly vilified?
Yeah, I think we've actually been seeing this for quite a few years now. It's often kind of a media-led campaign to sort of divide the sexes and to present this kind of ongoing sense of suspicion. It's also in the broader context of kind of safetyism, and I think also a kind of lack of a general moral code, sort of following the death of religion, if you like. So nobody really knows how to behave with each other anymore. And I think this has given rise to a kind of paranoia, which has largely been aimed at men and as Gus says, their sort of supposed or purported inability to contain themselves.
And Gus, where do you think the problem is starting, or I suppose stemming from here? Because one of the things you write in your piece about is what children are being told in schools. So there's one example of, I think, just a boy messaging a girl, and apparently that was a problem.
Yes, I mean that's an extraordinary story from a friend whose son's at an English day school, and he texted a girl from another school, basically just saying hello. And he was called up in front of the school authorities to explain his behaviour for the criminal act of unsolicited contact with a girl. I think the problem here is that children need to be exposed to different elements or different parts of kind of adult life, right? That's part of growing up. People need to learn how to have relationships. People need to learn how to deal with the kind of messiness of human life. And what we're doing is we're denying children that opportunity. And I think it's turning them into slightly kind of scared, sad, and withdrawn individuals. And I think it's a problem particularly with boys. But I mean, Nina made the point that that it's kind of pitting the sexes against each other. That's totally true. I mean, this isn't an argument that somehow girls or women are mistreating men. That isn't it at all. It's more a kind of culture, as Nina says, of safetyism.
And Nina, on that, do you think that what we're seeing here is, when we talk about rebranding masculinity, is there a risk that at least some of the people saying that is just almost ending masculinity and replacing it more with femininity?
Yeah, I think that's definitely happening, and it goes alongside the kind of feminization of the economy as well, and the sort of devaluing of sort of traditionally or typically male interests and talents and skills, so that everyone almost is being pushed towards becoming more feminine, which isn't good for men and it isn't good for women either, actually, so that we end up with this kind of totally proximate society in which men and women are kind of almost like siblings, rather than in any more interesting relation, let's say, of like compatibility or companionship or like complementarity. We don't kind of think of the relationship between men and women in that way very often, which is unfortunate, because in a way that is what we need to get along, whether it's as friends or as married couples, or and there's not enough value or time given to those kind of relations, I think.
And Gus, I suppose on that, we can talk about those who, and we've got plenty of examples in your piece, who are ultimately, in a way you could argue, trying to end masculinity as opposed to rebranding what their real motive is. But of course, you also have concerns, and perhaps it's what we see more in the media, that there is something called toxic masculinity. So, for example, if you look at Andrew Tate, that is someone that head teachers have been really concerned about. They think, lots of, if you ask your average person on the street, they might not know who that person is, or they may now have to recent stories. But yet, that person was very well known amongst pupil age, and it is teaching boys bad attitudes. Do you think there's a problem then, I suppose, with on the side of masculinity, that there are some people who are putting forward a toxic version of it?
Oh, totally. I totally agree with that. I mean, if you look at some of the things Andrew Tate says, they're just, totally objectionable. It's not an argument about defending people like Andrew Tate. But I think what's happened is that you've had other people like Jordan Peterson, people like Joe Rogan, who do exude a form of masculinity and put forward a kind of vision of masculinity, and those people are treated as kind of extremists too. I think you can disagree with people like Jordan Peterson. I certainly don't think he's an extremist, but part of the problem is when you treat those kinds of people in that way, you give rise to an even kind of further, more extreme kind of version.
Further,
yeah, exactly. And I think that's part of the problem, it's one of those things that's often decried in the media, the fact that there aren't, very many male role models anymore. But when they do pop up, they are kind of ruthlessly attacked. And so the boys, go looking for something even more kind of extreme and mental.
Nina, do you agree with that?
Yes, I would say someone like Andrew Tate could be seen as a kind of symptom. He's subversive and attractive precisely because partly he's saying things that you're not really allowed to say according to the mainstream dominant regime ideology, which isn't to defend Andrew Tate at all. And I think, I agree with Gus in the sense that even very moderate and mild positions like Jordan Peterson's, which is basically fundamentally telling young men to sort of sort themselves out and stop blaming the world and women for their problems and just get things in order, which is, really kind of basic stuff, but, delivered in this kind of patrician 1950s absent father figure, which I think is a big part of the problem kind of way. And I think what's generally missing is the question of virtue. Like, there isn't enough room to say, what does it mean to be a good man, right? So figures like men like Tate are presented, well, this is how you get on in the world through status and being, I don't know, really quite unpleasant. But what we really need is just kind of men, the possibility for men and young boys to be good, rather than this kind of fundamental assumption that there's something wrong with men, or that, boys and men are fundamentally badly aligned, or, which can't be the case, right? If we want to get on together, we have to allow that both men and women are moral agents as well. And so therefore we can talk about what it means to be a good man and what it means to be a good woman, and what it means to be together in a better way, basically.
Nina, I'm really interested in your point about virtue and about ethics. I think there was an interesting item in Charles Moore's notes last week when he pointed to, and this is a bit of a kind of side comment, but where he pointed to the civil service, where they're hiring kind of ethics officers. And there's almost this sense of kind of ethics and virtue being something that's done by specialists now, rather than something that we all have to deal with in our own lives. And when you do that, when you remove it, something else is going to come in and fill the gap. We just kind of don't even think about it in moral terms.
No, exactly. It's a total absence, and I think it's part of being in a kind of post-Christian, very mixed world that's also filled with very contradictory imperatives. Like, young men are often watching a lot of pornography. That gives you a vision of the world which is like overwhelmingly sexual, and a lot of young men then start to see the world in that way, exhibit and experience shame. They can't interact normally. But we need a much more kind of integrated culture that says, look, there are all these things you could possibly do, but some of them are actually bad for you and they're bad for society as a whole. We don't tend to think in that kind of socially integrated way. We think that everything is an individual decision and that desire is good and whatever people want is good. But this selfishness, this selfish society, completely mitigates against any collective project of virtue.
So, Gus, what do you think the answer is here when it comes to stopping this group feeling as though they are being isolated and they're being pushed, further in a certain direction? Is it less interference?
I don't really know. I kind of didn't get into it in the piece, and I almost did that on purpose because I don't know what the answers are. I think if there was someone here kind of disagreeing with me and Nina, they would be saying, "But hang on, there's a huge problem with sexual assault." I talk to my female friends, and they say, "You don't realise what it's like to sit on the tube on your own. You're constantly bombarded by men, behaving inappropriately." And I totally understand that. It seems like a very difficult problem to solve. I think part of the way of doing it, though, is allowing people the space to kind of make mistakes almost. So the woman that started Everyone's Invited, which is the movement that kind of led to a lot of these like boyhood initiatives and a lot of discussions about toxic masculinity, and it came about because there were a lot of accusations of sex assault at kind of big English private schools. She said when she launched it, she didn't want it to become kind of cover for cancel culture. She didn't want children to be kind of attacked for making mistakes. She just said she wanted people to recognize that there was a problem and in order to kind of better deal with it. But it shouldn't have been a kind of cancel culture thing. And I think maybe that's where we're going wrong. I mean, there's an example I use in the piece of a school in Essex where they've totally banned children from having any romantic relationships, from even touching each other, even hugs, and that's clearly a sign of an institution that's terrified of people making mistakes, of people getting upset, people being unhappy. That's part of being in relationships.
And Nina, I suppose on Gus's point, which is, lots of people will say, well, look at all these examples in the past in terms of men behaving badly. You look at harassment rates and so forth. You do need to have, the way to stop this is to, try and stem the problem early on, hence these talks in schools. So what would you say to them?
Yeah, I think I agree with Gus that there's this kind of, we have to allow people to make mistakes. I mean, we all make mistakes, and a lot of things are not badly intended, right? There's obviously a difference between somebody kind of intentionally upsetting somebody or behaving in a way that's kind of clearly goes against their wishes. But most of the time, in a lot of these kind of interactions, especially among teenagers, they're more awkward than badly intended, I think. And, to lump everything in together and to kind of infantilize everyone and keep them protected and keep them safe isn't going to allow people to become mature and become adult, which is partly arrived at through making mistakes. And that goes for girls and boys as well. I mean, it's not only boys making mistakes. So I think, we're going to end up with a kind of culture of permanent children who are sort of very scared and overprotected. And I think this isn't really the way to proceed. It doesn't set you up for dealing with the reality of life and its inevitable suffering. In fact, trying to keep people from suffering actually makes them suffer more, right? So I again, it's a very complicated question. I mean, I read Soma Serra's book and looked at the Everyone's Invited project. And really the only conclusion you could draw from the kind of terrifying picture that she paints of what it's like to be at schools is to go to single-sex schools and to keep boys and girls completely segregated until they're about 21 or something. I mean, it's really what she's describing as a kind of horrific environment filled with, boys just completely influenced by pornography. And, that may be worse. That may be worse than it was when we were at school. I'm not going to deny that, having porn on your phone is maybe more, of course, it's a different world in some ways. But I think the conclusion can't necessarily be that kind of total segregation. Then we're back to almost like a religious society, almost a theocracy. And we might need better ways of young men and women spending time together. We might need more thought about what rituals we have, right? But I think we're looking at a very kind of imbalanced picture, either total segregation or this kind of liberal free-for-all, and neither of which seem particularly satisfying.
I was going to say, Nina, on your point about infantilization and about making people more anxious by trying to stop them from suffering. I think we kind of risk going into a bit of a death spiral here in a way, because, and I'm going to say something quite kind of controversial, but I think part of the problem is that there's been a massive expansion in the definition of what kind of sexual misconduct is in the first place. So if you look at statistics on sex assault in schools from about 10, 15 years ago, it's much, much lower than the figures were in 2021. And I think part of that is because definitions are changing and definitions are expanding. And then that seems to almost encourage this kind of culture to go further, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, for sure.
And Gus, just finally, we're obviously at a period where, we're talking about schoolboys particularly, we've had the pandemic, which has meant even less social interaction than these people would have normally. I think, as Nina was touching on, if you are lurking in chat rooms, watching porn, and you're not actually speaking to people, this idea, that is one form of segregation in of itself. Do you think, despite all these attempts to almost keep boys and girls separate, that more interaction is actually the answer to normalise these relationships? Oh, totally.
And it's a form of self-segregation. It's the boys kind of withdrawing themselves, I think, because of this feeling that they can't really get anything right at all. It's a lot easier to just sit in your bedroom for most of your teens and 20s. You're not going to get in trouble with anyone. Sat there having a rather sad life, sat in your bed. One of the people I speak to in the piece is a child psychologist called Julie Lynn Evans, and when I spoke to her, she said the problem here is that boys and girls are being kind of pitted against each other, and girls are being told boys are dangerous, boys are being told you're a danger unto yourself and others, and actually it's untrue and it's unhelpful. The girls want boyfriends as much as the boys want girlfriends, and if we're going to continue as a society, people need to get married, have kids. That's how we continue as a species.
So also important to the future of mankind.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Gus. Thank you, Nina, for joining Spectator TV.